biggest beats in the business. HugeBeats.com.
Word up, party people.
Huge.
From HugeBeats.com. Today we're going to talk about balancing out your bass and your kick in your track. So keep in mind, you got to kind of pick one to dominate your track. You can't have a huge, roomy kick sound like in Rihanna's Umbrella and also throw a deep, fat bass on top of that. It's just going to be too much for two speakers. There's too many low-end frequencies going on. So you kind of have to pick which one you want to dominate your track. Having a lot of bass and a lot of kick in your track, think of it like having a wife and a girlfriend on the side. It's like, yeah, both are good to have, but you get them in the same room and there's going to be problems. So, keep it clean. So having said that, the first thing you should do before you start mixing is on all your tracks that are not your bass and your kick or anything that's acting like a bass line, like if it's a synth, you don't want to do it to that synth. But pretty much everything else, your keys, your guitars, your strings, your vocals, you want to add a low cut, also called a high pass filter. Reason that is, if you look here, I'm cutting the lows. Here are the low frequencies, and I'm taking them out. That's why it's called low cut. Or I'm letting the highs over here pass through. That's why it's also called a high pass. I call it a low cut because it's, I think, more self-explanatory. You're cutting the lows. Anyway, so on this guitar track, here it is with all the frequencies. And here it is with the low cutout. Alright, so as you can hear, you have pretty much the same information there. If it was a sparse track with just vocals and guitar, like Lil Wayne's How to Love or something like that, you may not want to do this. But if it's a busy mix with a lot of instruments, what happens is all your tracks, like your guitars and your synths and keys, are going to have this low information right here that you don't even necessarily hear that much. I mean, the difference is there, as you could hear, but it's not that great. Especially like around the 40 hertz, you want to cut all that out. Listen, you're not even going to hear a difference. So you can't really hear. But trust me, once you start cutting the 40 hertz out of all your tracks, you're going to leave yourself a whole bunch of room down there in the low frequencies to have your bass and your kick kind of really anchor your bottom end there. But as you can tell, like this guitar track, don't be afraid to take it up pretty high. Here we got 40 hertz. I mean, I took this all the way up to 350 hertz. Here's 300 without the low cut, with the low cut. So as you can hear, and if it's a super busy track and you just want the shimmer of this guitar, you might want to just go up to here, almost 900, just depending. But anyway, cut out all the low end from all the tracks that you possibly can and just leave that job to your kick and your bass. Alright, so one way you can kind of figure out where the energy is in your kick drum. Here's my kick. I'm going to insert a multiscope. Bring that up. Solo. Here's a multiscope. Put it on frequency, make it 31 bands. You can see there's a lot of energy here, like between 40 and 50 hertz, and then up here by like 125. So if I don't want that to conflict with my bass, I'm going to bring my bass up. I'm going to turn this on, go to 125, which is where the frequency was on the kick. And I'm going to turn that down by a few dB. So that'll give the kick its room it needs for its frequencies, and this hasn't really affected the bass too much. And you can do the same with your bass and cut it out of the kick if you wanted to. Alright, but let's say you have a track like this. Here's a kick. Here's a bass. So, not much you can do there, except carve out different EQ areas for each one. So, you're telling me, Huge, I want a loud bass and I want a loud kick. I don't care what you say about picking one. All right, then, well, here's how you're going to do it. Here's your kick. Here's your bass. So I'm going to turn on how I've EQ'd it here. I put a low cut on a kick. I'm going to not put one on a bass because I want the bass to have that low end. Sometimes you might want to do the opposite. And here's my bass track. Now, as you can see, I put a little bump in the 100 hertz of the kick. I took out 3 dB of the 400 hertz, and I added a little 3K. In my bass line, I added 3 dB in the 400 hertz area where I subtracted from the kick. So in other words, what I took out of the kick, I added in to the bass line here. And that's so you can each can have their own separate space. What I've added here to the bass also is some 4K, and that's so you can hear like the high end, so it kind of cuts through more. So I'll play that. Listen as I add the 4K also, more 4K to the bass. So as you can hear it clicking. It's way too much, obviously, but you can hear it makes it more defined, not as masked by the kick. So that's one thing you can do, and of course, I put a compressor on the bass. Kind of glues everything together. So that's one thing you can do if you have to have kick and bass at the same time. Okay, so another option you have is side chaining the kick and the bass. In this situation, you got a 4 on the floor kick drum and a bass line over that, like an octave bass line. So you can hear the bass and the kick are kind of masking each other because they're eating up the same frequencies. And this is a technique you'll find in some dance music too, to get the mix kind of pumping. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to open up our bass track, insert a compressor that has sidechain capabilities. I made a preset here. And you're going to turn on side chaining by clicking this button, Activate Side Chain. Once you got that done, you're going to open up your kick channel, and you're going to send to the side chain of the bass compressor. Turn that on, give it a healthy level, and you're going to make sure that the pre-fader button is on. What the pre-fader button does is it makes this act like another fader. In other words, if I turn down the kick here, this is still going to be feeding signal all the way to this compressor. So you'll hear it working here. You can hear the pumping of the bass. I'll turn the kick down. You can still hear it pumping. I deactivate it, and you hear the whole bass line again without the pumping. Here's with it. Alright, so what that is doing, see if I can zoom in here, is basically this automatically. So when this kick hits, it's turning down your bass. And then it comes up again once the kick stops. And then the next kick comes in, turns it down, and then the volume comes up on the bass again after the kick stops hitting. Kick hits again, and the same thing. But you can see how much of a time waster this is doing it this way. So that's why you do it automatically. And so the side chain basically takes this kick. Every time the kick hits, it affects the compressor you've inserted on the bass channel and turns that down so you can hear the kick. That's without it. So it's a big difference. You can get it to create that pumping effect, which is kind of, add some excitement to your mix. Keep in mind, to get this working properly, you'll have to mess with the release time of your compressor to get it pumping in time with your music. Otherwise, it can sound too squashed or out of time. That's it. If you have any other questions, post them here. Don't forget to like, follow, all that BS. See you next time.
Huge beats, the biggest beats